Peace be with you. Those are the words that Jesus speaks to his disciples on the day of his resurrection, his first appearance to his friends in the upper room after he rises gloriously from the dead. And they are the words that they long to hear, the words they need to hear from their brother, their friend, their teacher. And in fact, John's Gospel records that Jesus repeated those words. Peace be with you. These are words that we too are longing to hear right now, especially those of us here in Minnesota. On my drive to the church today, I could smell the smoke from the fires that still smolder in St. Paul and Minneapolis. Fires that began out of a sense of outrage at an unjust death, at a shameful and humiliating death of a black man at the hands of Minneapolis police officer. The death of George Floyd. Remember his name. Say his name. George Floyd, who deserved all of the respect, all of the dignity, all of the pride that each and every one of us who claims to be a child of God deserves. And the response and the reaction to his death and the way it was live streamed to so many millions on Facebook has prompted a visceral response of anger from a place of injustice and indignity that's been growing for over 400 years since the first slave ship arrived on the shores of North America in 1619. That after all of this talk of freedom and equality and unity, we know that we are not all treated equally, even yet today. We fought a great civil war over 150 years ago to try to put an end once and for all to slavery and injustice, and we only seem to have gotten halfway. Slavery is illegal, but somehow, some way we have never healed in this nation. We have never fully owned our racism. We have never fully owned the injustice that has been suffered at the hands of people of color for so many hundreds of years. And that boiled over after Mr. Floyd's death. That boiled over and erupted into the streets in a way of marking that shame, marking that humiliation that not only they felt on behalf of George Floyd, but on behalf of themselves, for the lives of generations of Black Americans who have suffered humility and injustice and shaming at the hands of white Americans. America has never fully embraced people of color. We've given lip service and we've given a lot of talk and a lot of half measures to it, but we admire the problem and have never really worked and done the deep work that we need to do to try to resolve it. It is work that is hard. It is work that is painful. It is work that we need to undertake. It is work for which we need God's help. We need God's hope. We need God's love. Above all, we need God's peace. You see, we remember that Jesus, too, was executed publicly in full view of everyone from the main road leading into Jerusalem on the hill that we call Golgotha. Civil authority has always wanted to try to control people by shaming and humiliating them, by trying to do something that would deter others from ever thinking that they could dare to challenge the privileged authority that was ruling the land. And that sense of shame, that sense of injustice, that sense of humiliation echoes with Christians around the world, because that's what happened to Jesus. And that same kind of shame and degradation, that same kind of insult to the dignity of humanity was suffered by George Floyd. And after 400 years of feeling this, are any of us surprised that this city and these cities that I call home erupted into violence and erupted into protest? Oh, it seems now perhaps to have been taken over by other forces, by other things at work here now that are trying to subvert the civil authority, and people who didn't perhaps care about George Floyd or what happened to him, and that's a shame. And that makes me very sad. But in the midst of all of that, we cannot lose sight of the fact of George Floyd's death and of what that means. What it means to African Americans in the Twin Cities, what it means to Black Americans across this country, what it means to persons of color who still feel the persecution and the oppression and the marginalization and the humiliation that is thrust upon them by those of us holding the privilege, holding the power. We must work to end that shame. We must work to end that oppression. We must work to end that marginalization. Above all, we must work to end the injustices that leave those deaths as such open wounds on our national soul and make such a deep imprint in our national psyche. Jesus himself called us to love. He called us to transcend all of our differences and to understand that we are beloved children of God, that we are beloved children endowed with gifts, endowed with wonderful, glorious gifts to share life and love and hope with one another. And all of us have been given these gifts from God graciously and freely. All of us deserve and have a right to that respect, to that dignity that Jesus has promised to us. We must strive to overcome the hatred and the separation that has kept us apart for far too long. We must remember that we are loved and to love others. We must remember that the way of Jesus is the way of love, the way of hope, the way of peace. And if we're going to follow in the way that Jesus has given us, we must work hard and with God's help to make sure that that way of love, that way of hope, that way of peace is a way that is open to all God's beloved children. It is a sad and sorrowful time. It is a time when we must look to ourselves and into our own hearts and souls and to see where we may be complicit in the injustices, in the iniquities that are still plaguing this nation with racial divide. We must do the hard work to look inside at the kind of socialized and institutionalized racism that continues to lead to the kind of violence we saw perpetrated on George Floyd at the hand of a Minneapolis police officer. We must own that. We must own the fact that we too are accountable. Because if all we do is shake our head and say it's such a shame, then we have not done enough. We should be indicted as well, because we are complicit in letting this kind of oppression, this kind of humiliation, this kind of injustice continue. If we are following the way of Jesus, we must follow the way of truth and justice. We must be able to lead others and to show the beacon of Christ's light that shines in the Paschal candle that burns behind me today. We must be able to walk in that light and in that way of Christ and hold our heads up and know that we have done the work we needed to do, the hard work, to end all injustice, all iniquity, all racism in this land and across the world. It is hard work, but it is work that we can undertake with God's help. God will walk with us. God, who has shown us the way of Jesus, will show us the way of love, the way of hope, the way of peace. I don't know if you have the courage to watch the 10-minute video of George Floyd's death. I don't know if you have what it takes to be able to watch another human die before your very eyes. That was the courage, that was the hope that the disciple whom Jesus loved, the disciple we call John, the disciple for whom the fourth gospel is named, that is the kind of courage that he had as he stood at the foot of the cross and watched his friend, his beloved friend, die at the hands of civil authority. Jesus' mother Mary, who is our patron here at St. Mary's Church, stood at the foot of the cross and watched the shameful, humiliating, unjust death of her son. Do we have the courage to watch the death of George Floyd? Do we have the courage to face up to the work that we must do to try to set the record straight, to get justice and hope for his family, to bring equity and peace to our society? Do we have the courage? Do we have what it takes to make that happen? We will, with God's help. Jesus gave us his peace. Jesus left us the Spirit to guide us and to give us courage. Jesus walks with us in this journey. I pray that you will take up Jesus' cross. You will take up what it takes to meet the authority and to challenge it appropriately. I pray that you have the courage of your convictions, the courage of your faith, the courage of Jesus' mother and the disciple whom he loved. I pray we all have the courage to do what we must do, to make hope and love and peace the watchwords of our world.